Don't know me, my name is Tom. I'm one of the executive members of the Canterbury Socialist Society. Hugely grateful to see you along this evening for our Fred Evans Memorial Lecture. Very briefly about the Society, we are a membership-based organisation that formed in Aotearoa in sort of 2017 and properly in 2018 kind of thing. Since then we've slowly been joined by similar organisations or fraternal regional groups, the Wellington Socialist Society and the Aotearoa Socialist Society, so now part of a little federation in our fine country. We do these sorts of educational events as well as a social event every month. If you don't currently get information from us at all, there is a mailing list sign-up sheet just by the door. You also find copies of the Commonweal there, which are available for $5 each. The most recent one just came out over Labour weekend, and it's looking fantastic, so do check it out. As always, a huge thank you to Space Academy and the team here for hosting us. It's been sort of our home for all of these years for these public lectures, and they've always been such gracious hosts, and we're really lucky to have such a venue that's so welcoming and willing to let us come and do these sorts of events. As far as the event itself goes, so we started doing this a few years ago, I want to say maybe 5 years ago. It was posited as an event where we'd focus on some aspect of working class politics or history in New Zealand specifically. We would invite a speaker to come and speak of a topic of their choice, or in this case sort of our choice. We sort of got to tell John what to research, which is great. And we're actually finally looking at the period where the name comes from. So if you don't know, Fred Evans is one of the few people in New Zealand in the Labour movement specifically to have been martyred. In 1912 he was in a miners' hall in Waihi, and a presumably drunk group of right-wing strikebreakers aided by the police broke into the miners' hall looking to move them along, basically, and in the kerfuffle, a police officer was shot in the stomach, and in retaliation, Fred Evans was beaten so badly, then arrested, and he died in jail later that night. I believe a very early member of the New Zealand Labour Party, if you can believe it, was once asked about this situation, because the claim from the state and the cops at the time was that Fred Evans had a revolver and was the shooter and shot this police officer. The police officer was fine anyway, but nonetheless, he was asked about this. And he said something along the lines of, "I don't know if Fred Evans shot that cop. I have no reason to believe he shot that cop. But if he had, he was only doing his duty, and the only shame is he didn't shoot more of them." Talking specifically in the context of strike breaking, I think, but nonetheless an interesting sentiment that I don't think we'd get from many of the current Labour politicians. So yeah, it's my delight just to introduce John very briefly, and I'll hand it over to him. He'll speak till about 8 p.m, and then we'll have a quick break and come back for questions and stuff. John is a recently retired and newly wed former trade unionist organiser and educator before that, with a keen interest in history, including military history, and it's a great pleasure to invite him to come and do this talk. I will hand it over to him very shortly, but I think a few of us went up to the conference in Wellington over Labour weekend that the Federation did, and actually did a walking tour organised by Peter Clayworth, a historian up there, and the walking tour was of the 1913 Great Strike. So hopefully those of you who went along to that will be recognising different terms, different places. It's a very interesting part of New Zealand history, particularly New Zealand Labour history. It's arguably the closest New Zealand's come to a sort of working class revolution. How close exactly was that? I'm going to leave that to John to talk about, I think, because he's done the research. So please join me in welcoming John Kerr.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Is this working? Everyone can hear me? Yep. Okay, thank you. Kia ora koutou. My name's John Kerr, as Tom has said. I had some training as a historian in the dim and distant past, but I wouldn't say I'm a historian. I'm more a consumer or a student of history. And I spent 20 years as a full-time paid union official. Before that, I was a workplace rep. I very much believe that our view of the present and any possible futures we may have is grounded in our appreciation and understanding of our past. So I think having an understanding of events like what occurred in 1913 is critical to the labour movement and to socialists in general. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about that series of events that occurred over a relatively short period of time in late 1913 on into early 1914, and the impact that it had on the labour movement and wider New Zealand society. And because I'm not an academic, I'm not going to take an academic approach. I'm mindful that many of you are across the minutiae of the narrative, whereas some of you may know very little about the subject in question. So I'm only going to describe the narrative of what happened insofar as it assists me to reflect on some of the lessons of 1913 and to raise some questions and hopefully inspire you to do some further reading. And on that note, if you have a copy of the Common Wheel, and I understand there's a box of them here, so if you're a member, you'll have this. If you're not a member, then consider getting your hands on a copy. I'm sure palms can be greased. Then there's an excellent article in here by the editor, Martin Crick, about the 1913 strike, and that's a really good place to start. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a preamble, which will be on strikes and industrial action in general. And then I'm going to put the events of 1913 in their historical context. And then finally, I'm going to try and come to some conclusions. And I promise you that those conclusions will be questionable and debatable, because that's part of what I want to try and achieve this evening, is to raise some interest and hopefully start a few debates and a few arguments amongst people, get the dialectic going. Okay, so just very briefly, I spent the 11 years up to 2022 working for the Rail and Maritime Transport Union. So if you Google my name and the RMTU, it's really not very pretty. During my union career, I was involved in a lot of strikes and lockouts, but the two most high-profile disputes I've been involved with were the 2018 disputes with Littleton Port Company and also simultaneously the Transdev, which was responsible for running rail passenger services in Auckland. And these were both prolonged and acrimonious disputes by modern standards, although the actual time we spent on strike or locked out was relatively short. So that was perhaps my most vivid experience, but I've had a lot of experience of strikes and lockouts. And along the way, I learned a few things, and I just want to share those with you because it really informs how I look at what happened in 2013. And I'm also mindful there are people here who work for unions, have worked for unions, are active in their unions, are union members, have been on the other side of the table from unions, and maybe this will inform some of your thinking about how you do what you do. So what I've learned about striking can be summed up pretty concisely. I firmly believe that strategic militancy gets results for workers. So I'm going to look at 1913 in the context of strategic militancy. And I'm going to flesh out what I understand by strategic militancy. Okay? So unless you're under an existential threat as a worker, a union member, a union official, or the established order of society is about to collapse, for example, a right-wing military takeover or a revolutionary situation has developed, then striking or locking out workers, for that matter, is simply preparation for getting around a table and hammering out a deal with the other side. Right? Unless you're under an existential threat or it's a revolutionary situation, all it is preparation for getting around a table. I believe, secondly, that you should always have clear aims and objectives when you're going on strike. And I want you to think about that when I describe what went on in 1913. In fact, I would advise any unionist to always have clear aims and objectives whenever you're interacting with the employer or a third party on behalf of members. Those aims and objectives should be measurable and they should be achievable. In layman's terms, you need to know what winning looks like. When I was working, I was often asked by members to give advice on an issue, and the first question I'd say is, what are we trying to achieve here? And disappointingly, I was often, that question was often met with silence. It's critical that members support and are united around aims and objectives. And as and union leadership has a responsibility to ruthlessly subordinate everything that they do or don't do to those aims and objectives. And I use the term don't do deliberately because doing something badly is sometimes worse than doing nothing at all. So calling a stoppage, holding a protest, mounting a picket, if it's not supported and the membership don't support it, then that's actually worse than doing nothing at all, because all you're doing is sending the opposition a message that you're weak. Now, that's not to say that your aims and objectives can't change. And again, I want you to think about this when I describe what happened in 1913. It's not a paradox to say, be flexible. Somebody once said that plans are useless, but planning is invaluable. Anybody who's worked in a union or in a union leadership position will know that sometimes members just get angry and they just want to kick the boss. Material considerations at that point in time aren't a high priority. In my experience, that almost quickly changes, and you have to adapt and you have to change with that. So again, bear that in mind when we talk about 1913. Find the pressure point. There's always a critical point. Our German comrades would call it the Schwerpunkt, the centre of gravity. That's the place where your efforts are best spent. That might be economic. You know the employer can't run the business without overtime. It might be in the court of public opinion. The public may not be sympathetic to Wharfies getting a pay rise, but they don't approve of an employer that is perceived as not taking care of health and safety. So work out where the critical point is. Again, think about these things in the context of what we're going to be looking at. There will always be friction. Now, friction I define as a combination of two things: Murphy's Law and the fog of war. You will get stuck in traffic on the way to that critical meeting. That's friction. It's Murphy's Law. These things happen, all right? The fog of war is that when you're in an industrial dispute, you do not have perfect information. It is not like playing chess. It's more akin to a game of cards, and you don't know what cards the opposition are holding. Not for sure. I mean, you may have an idea. And I also think about Hemingway when he was asked, how did you go bankrupt? And he said, first slowly and then quickly. All right? Well, the same is true when you're in a fight. Yeah? You start to lose or win slowly. You may not even be aware of it. And then suddenly the dam bursts. So you win or you lose, first slowly, then quickly. On winning, know when to win and pick up what's on the table. I would argue that the side that's often deemed to be the winner in 1913 actually didn't, because they didn't pick up what was on the table. Unless it's that military putsch or the Berlin Wall is coming down, there's always going to be a next time when you're going to be dealing with the people on the other side of the table. If you end the dispute weaker than when you went in, you've been defeated. So one aim that you should always have is to build organisation. What does that mean? It means membership participation. That can be measured. Attendance at meetings, recruitment, that kind of thing. Build the confidence and capacity of your workplace leaders. Build your membership density. So try and keep those things in mind. We're going to go back in time now to 1913, a time when New Zealand was a settler colony of 1 million people and only 850 police. There was a small military presence. I'm not too sure how big that was. New Zealand had fought its first overseas war in support of the British in South Africa at the turn of the century. There was a territorial system, but the military presence wasn't great. Out of the 1 million New Zealanders, approximately 300,000 of those were in the workforce. The number of unionised workers was 72,000. So overall union density was about 24%. Now today it's around about 18%. Yeah? The difference is that I think in 1913 it was probably tracking upwards, whereas today at best it's stagnant, at worst it's declining. Now, of those 72,000 unionised workers, between 14 and 16,000 were involved in the events of 1913. So around 20% of the unionised workforce was involved in the strikes and the lockouts, and around 5% of the overall workforce. So that just gives you a bit of context. It wasn't all about the numbers though, because the people who were involved were in critical industries, mainly the mines and watersiders on the wharfs. There were some seafarers, not the deep sea companies that were shipping refrigerated meat to the UK, but the coastal shippers, they were involved. A lot of drivers got involved, and the action did extend at one stage to other workers, most notably in Auckland. The industrial relations system at the time was built around something called the Industrial Conciliation and Arbitration Act. It's a bit of a mouthful, so I'm just going to call it the Arbitration Act from now on. And very crudely, unions that registered under that act gave up their right to strike, but they could force an employer into compulsory arbitration at a court where a judge and an employer's rep and a union rep would present an award which would set wages and terms and conditions for workers under the coverage clause of that award. Now that system was a child of the Liberal government that had come to power in 1890 after the Great Maritime Strike, in which unions had been smashed. The Liberals were generally sympathetic to organised labour, and they brought this system in largely because the unions were weak. Martin talks about this in his article. He describes how New Zealand became known as the land of no strikes, and yet the arbitration system, certainly in its early years, delivered regular pay increases and set terms and conditions for workers. And of course, the Liberal government also passed factory acts and anti-sweating legislation and that kind of thing. Okay. By the mid years of the first decade of the 20th century, the mid-1900s, however, there was growing disillusionment with the arbitration system. It didn't seem to be delivering increases that kept pace with the cost of living. And in 1908, there's a celebrated strike, an illegal strike, by a union that was registered under the Act at Blackball over on the west coast, over meal breaks of all things. And the union was taken to court, lost the case, but certainly won in the court of public opinion and became a cause célèbre. And over time, they got their meal break. The union deregistered from the Arbitration Act, and because it had an alternative. Arbitrationism led to a multiplicity of unions. They were often based around a particular craft, a trade and or a work site. In 1908, and this is the alternative that those Blackball strikers had, a trade union act was passed which legalised strikes. It also legalised lockouts. And so that meant you could get back the right to strike if you registered under that act as a union. You couldn't force the employer into arbitration anymore, so you're going to have to rely on your industrial strength to progress your members' interests. The non-arbitrationist unions, as they became known, tended to be in dangerous industries like mining and on the waterfront. And these, of course, were male-dominated. And let's not forget that this is at a time when there was a very particular view of manhood. this Edwardian time, when Scott was, I'm going outside and I may be some time. Scott was going down to the Antarctic. Women and children were getting into lifeboats first before the men on the Titanic. To be a man, there was a very particular view of that. Nowadays, we would call that very patriarchal, but at the time, that's the time that we lived in. And another aspect of that in these difficult and dangerous industries was you relied on your workmates. It was a matter of life and death. And you didn't trust the boss, but you trusted your workmates. And that was generated a great deal of camaraderie and solidarity. So, as I said, the arbitration system tended to result in these small little unions, patchwork around the place, small coverage, covering a work site or a particular occupation. The first steps towards a national industrial union was taken by the formation of the Miners' Federation, and then subsequently was broadened out to welcome all workers, and it was known as the Federation of Labour in 1909. And that was the Red Feds. Now, we're going to call it the Red Feds Mark I, all right? Because in 1912, there was a dispute in Waihi. Tom has spoken a little bit about that. Not going to go into the detail of it. We really don't have time. But the strikers in Waihi were smashed by a combination of the employer setting up a arbitrationist union, which would, if an award was in place, would cover their work, and so the employer argued that any strike action would be illegal, which then allowed them to call in the police. There was a bit of violence. Fred Evans tragically lost his life. Police Commissioner John Cullen, we're going to hear about him a little bit later, had the backing of a Conservative Reform Party government, which had just come to power that year. The Liberals had finally, their coalition had collapsed, and Massey was certainly anti-organised labour. 67 strikers were locked up, and Fred Evans tragically lost his life. The union was smashed and the strikers driven out of town. So Waihi was a defeat. Now, some workers, most notably in Auckland, according to this guy, Eric Olson, not this guy, this that wrote this book, Eric Olson, some workers started to distrust the Red Feds after this defeat. There were miners at Huntly who were dissatisfied with how disputes progressed, and there was also an Auckland building labourers dispute where people were not too happy, members were not too happy with their leadership. So some militant unions began to leave the Federation of Labour. Some historians argue this was prompted by a growing interest in something called syndicalism. Now, syndicalism is often spoken about in the context of 1913. Very simply, it's a notion that comes from France. It's the idea that workers, through exercising their industrial strength, can affect revolutionary change. The syndicalists give us, and the French, have given us the word sabotage, because, of course, French factory workers, the clogs they wore were called sabots. They would throw these into the machines to stop the machine working, hence the term sabotage. In New Zealand, syndicalism took its lead largely from something known as the IWW, or the International Workers of the World, or the Wobblies, who were strongest in the US. And the Wobblies rejected state socialism. Now, I find this fascinating because at that time, state socialism didn't exist anywhere in the world. So this is before the Russian Revolution. It's before the Russian Civil War, the Ukrainian famine, Stalin's purges, the glorious siege of Stalingrad, Moscow Dynamo back four, all of that. All right? It's, but the Wobblies, they rejected state socialism, and they rejected the system of, they said, of wage slavery. People like me, paid union officials, as I was, were treated with suspicion, especially those in arbitrationist unions. We were gutless parasites seeking to control labour. And the Wobblies said you could really only trust the worker at the point of production. I think we can exaggerate the influence of the syndicalists on what happened in 1913. They published a newspaper in Auckland. It had a circulation of 4,000, but the arbitrationist moderate unions in Christchurch and Wellington published their own paper, which had a circulation of 60,000. So if the influence is in any way proportionate to the circulation of the newspapers, then I think there's a risk of exaggerating that. Incidentally, the most popular pro-strike newspaper in 1913 was the New Zealand Truth, which in those days was apparently a left-leaning racist scandal sheet and not the right-wing racist scandal sheet that some of you may remember. I don't even know if it's still going. Is it still going? They've probably gone on, probably a website now. Anyway, in July 1913, there were two so-called unity conferences which were called, and these led to the formation of the Social Democratic Party. It was a merger of the pro-direct action Socialist Party and something called the United Labour Party, which hadn't backed the Waihi Strike. And so they put their differences to one side and they formed the Social Democratic Party. And another organisation that was stitched together was the United Federation of Labour. And that is really the second iteration of the Red Feds. Now, where they had been replaced by arbitrationist unions, militants had proved very capable of taking them over time. But in 1913, it was probably too soon after the Waihi defeat, and the United Federation of Labour, I'm going to call it the UFL from now on, the UFL had militant and moderate union affiliates, but it was, according to Eric Olson, an idea rather than a functioning organisation. It had no real ability to direct its more powerful affiliates. So this is in the middle of 1913. The major dispute broke out in October, and this is part of the problem. So from May 1913, and there were two events that triggered what became the so-called Great Strike. There were two events. One happened on the Wellington waterfront. There was some shipwrights who had been in an arbitrationist union. They had a falling out with their employer, which confusingly was called the Union Steamship Company. Now, union in this context is like the Union of Great Britain and Ireland, not unions as we understand them. They had a falling out with their employer, the Union Steamship Company, over travelling allowances of all things. They deregistered from the Arbitration Act, and they turned for support to the Wellington Waterside Workers' Union. Bit of a mouthful. And the disagreement then extended into pay and other conditions, and they were negotiating from May through to October, and on the 18th of October, the shipwrights went on strike. They appealed to the wharfies for support, and the wharfies had a stop work meeting. It's all very precise, this. It's interesting how, when you read about it, how some things are very precise and other things are very, very woolly. At 8 a.m. on the 20th of October. And they decided to refer the dispute to the UFL and then went off back to work. So, there's a bit of trouble, there's a bit of a blue going on. We'll refer it to those blokes at the UFL, and they can sort it out. All right? And I'm not sure if Heine's in the room, but if he is, he'll be smiling now. So we've got ourselves in the shit, and now we're just going to refer it to those guys to go and sort it out. Anyway, they went back to work, but they weren't allowed in at work because, in the meantime, their employer, the Harbour Board, had locked them out. And there was then a bit of a row amongst themselves. They had a row with their president, and in defiance of their president, they held another meeting, and by they, this was 1,500 workers, so that tells you how many people, the wharves employed in those days. And they decided that no work shall be accepted until such time as the victimised men are reinstated. Now, the key point in that is no work shall be accepted. So even though these unions were on the waterfront were supposed to be strong and militant, the work was still casualised. All right? And I mean, I can't get to the bottom of that. There's still a question in my head how that happened. More or less at the same time, or a couple of weeks before, the employer at Huntly Mine sacked 16 miners, some of whom were on the union executive, all of whom were active unionists, and the miners voted to go on strike until they were reinstated, and as well as some of their mates who had been refused work since a strike the previous year. The UFL wrote to them and congratulated them on their stance, and the miners promptly handed the dispute to the UFL and said, "You sort it out." So there's a bit of a pattern emerging here. Now, we've got to remember the UFL is still just an idea. It's not a functioning organisation at this time. And also, and I think this is a key point, neither of these disputes were planned by the workers or their unions. They were a reaction to employer militancy. I think it would be erroneous to credit the employer with a master plan to smash the unions. The employers certainly wanted to smash the unions, but I don't think they had a master plan. The employers were very concerned about the Red Feds. They were concerned about militancy. They were concerned about the arbitration system being eroded. But I suspect they were as disorganised as the UFL, at least at the outset. There was one gentleman, however, who seems to have faded from the history books, William Pryor, and he was secretary of the Employers' Federation. And some years before, he'd helped set up a fund to combat militancy, socialism, and syndicalism. And of course, the advent of the Reform government in 1912 must have set his pulse racing, because here was at last he had a government who would crack down on these militants and socialists and syndicalists. He must have been a very busy man, Mr. Pryor. He was also secretary of the Mine Owners Association, secretary of the Ship Owners Association, and something called the Employers, Farmers and Citizens Defence Committee. And I'm sure they had an acronym for that. So he was a militant employer, and he had an influential position. However, the Union Steamship Company, remember them? They were a lot more moderate. They'd had a go at setting up pro-company unions after the 1890 dispute, and they'd failed dismally. And they also understood they had a lot of interests in Australasia, on the waterfront, and they knew if you were going to manage ports in an environment where the boss was distrusted, then peace with honour and a strong union was the way to do it. So they were more sophisticated and relatively enlightened. And they also had a much broader perspective, because they were what today we would call a multinational. So the point I'm trying to make there is the employers were by no means monolithic. I think that their militancy was driven by incompetence and overconfidence. I think that the employers were emboldened by a Conservative government. They put their faith in Pryor, and they ended up overplaying their hand in 1913. But that's jumping ahead a little bit. They did want to destroy the Red Feds, the UFL. That was their documented aim. But I don't think they had any real understanding of the impact that confrontation would have on public opinion. Now, as the dispute went on, other unions were drawn into it. So the so-called Great Strike was therefore a series of strikes and lockouts that was occasioned by a reaction to the employers. Most ports and coal mines were closed within a few days of the events in Wellington and in Huntly. Now, go back to what I was saying earlier about maintenance of aim, having clear goals, aims and objectives. In all the reading that I've done on 1913, I can't see much evidence or discussion whether the Unionists ever did that kind of exercise. There was some discussion as to the merits or otherwise of a general strike, but it seems to me that the unions and the UFL stumbled into the disputes in 1913. They didn't have much by way of clear objectives, apart from, in the end, survival. So when I say that you should always have clear aims and objectives and you should always plan, I'm not saying that workers shouldn't take opportunities when they arise, but 1913 can hardly be characterised as an opportunity. The UFL was in its infancy. It lacked authority, particularly in Auckland. Secondly, the time of year was all wrong. The wharves weren't that busy. Lambing had finished, but the killing season hadn't started. It was springtime and demand for coal was dropping. And thirdly, you had a right-wing Conservative government in power that was prepared to use the state to try and crush organised labour. So from the comfort of my armchair in 2024, it looks to me like the watersiders in Wellington got themselves out of their depth. They handed the problem to the UFL. The rank and file clearly lacked confidence in their own leadership. Reading the detail of subsequent negotiations, it looks to me that the UFL lacked the leverage and the expertise to get a result, whatever a result meant. You could argue that the waterside workers' leadership was pretty smart in dumping the problem on the UFL because then they could blame them when the inevitable defeat happened. Anyway, in the meantime, the ports are closed and most of the coal mines, notably the gold mines, Waihi being one of them, remained open. By and large, the arbitrationist, so-called moderate unions didn't come out in support, although checks were written. The railway workers didn't come out in support. They were very powerful. It was impossible to staff the railways with scab labour, but they weren't prepared to risk their superannuation by taking action which could be deemed illegal. So the railway workers, I think, donated money, but they didn't actually come out on strike. Now, there's a fair bit of rhetoric around 1913 that it's the closest we've ever come to civil war. Well, I've been up in an aeroplane, and that's the closest I've ever come to the moon. I think a lot of this rhetoric is breathless hyperbole. I think some historians they've really got to sell the book. So having it titled "Revolution" is more likely to get someone to pick it up than if it's entitled. Well, anyway, you can fill in the gaps. We get all sorts of statements like New Zealand apparently came closer to Pākehā civil war than any time in its history. A spectre haunted the colonial bourgeoisie. Well, did it? There was certainly violence in 1913. The violence was precipitated by an attempt to use scab labour on the Wellington waterfront, and there was an abortive attempt by the police, not many of them, to prevent a mass meeting of workers at Basin Reserve. Some scuffles broke out, and those have been described as riotous. The government invoked the territorial system and started to recruit special constables in rural areas. These are the infamous Cossacks. Many of them were mounted on horseback. They first arrived in Wellington on the 30th of October. There's plenty of evidence that the regular police didn't like the specials. They considered them ill-disciplined. Of course, the term Cossacks would have resonated at that time because it was the Cossack regiments that the Tsar used to put down civil disorder in autocratic Tsarist Russia at that time. The key event in Wellington was on the 5th of November. Supporters of the strike clashed with mounted special constables. They were riding from their base. They were based at Buckle Street up in Mount Cook to Lambton Station. And they were escorting racehorses, of all things. You couldn't make this up. They were escorting racehorses to the wharves so they could be shipped to Christchurch for this week, for New Zealand Cup Week. And there was some violence. A battle raged on Featherston Street. The specials charged the strikers. A pro-strike tram driver rammed some specials on horseback. It must have been brilliant, eh? The specials later assumed control of the wharfs, however, and that was a decisive moment in the strike, because from that point onwards, the port was very on its way to being reopened. There are various allegations about the use of firearms. There was no licensing firearms in those days. Apparently, the gunsmiths sold out of revolvers. Machine guns were supposedly set up by the military on Buckle Street to protect the specials camp. Whether the machine guns were loaded, I don't know. Apparently, some of the military paraded with fixed bayonets. The only military presence in Wellington at that time were some artillerymen, so they probably wouldn't have known what to do with the bayonets. Their chief of staff was absolutely apoplectic about this. He said very, very strongly that the British military don't get involved in this sort of thing. That's unless it involves the Irish or black people. Strikers and specials are alleged to have brandished and fired revolvers, but nobody got killed. And from what I can gather, nobody got seriously injured. So they must have been pretty bad shots. Detonators were thrown at horses. Now, detonators are used by railway workers. You put them on the track, and if a train goes over the detonator, it makes a bang, and the train driver knows he's about to plough into a load of track workers. So that's where the detonators most likely came from. But they would have made a bang. A hotel that entertained specials in Wellington was trashed, not once, but twice. Every window was broken. Some of the fighting seems to be over space. Post Office Square had the misfortune of hosting the offices of the Waterside Workers' Union, the Union Shipping Company, the Harbour Board, and there was a waiting room there where casual labour was employed. And after the specials got control of the waterfront, that was turned into a dormitory for scabs. And there were mass meetings here. Nothing was torched, however. No one was killed. But I think there was a lot of running about and shouting and probably a few scuffles. So anybody who, like me, attended football matches in England or Scotland in the late 1970s would know exactly what was going on here. On the west coast, the pattern was the opposite of Auckland to Wellington, and arguably in Lyttelton. The forces of reaction came in from the countryside in the big cities. On the coast, it was strikers from small settlements like Runanga who rode into Greymouth and basically took over the town. However, going back to the numbers I described earlier, it seems from my reading that most people were simply trying to muddle through, and as they generally do most of the time, and the disputes had a limited impact. On the 8th of November, the specials in Auckland took over the Auckland wharves. They instead of trying to get there piecemeal, as they'd done in Wellington, they did it en masse. And that did trigger a general strike. The UFL called a one-day general strike on the 10th of November, and their impotency was illustrated by the fact the strike continued for over a week and a half, and some arbitrationist unions backed it. The UFL was very concerned at this point. Their leadership had been arrested for sedition. The wharves had been taken back by the specials or the Cossacks, and the UFL was feared a repeat of 1890, where they would lose everything the labour movement had gained since then. And those Auckland workers who went on strike, they didn't have any exit strategy, and by the 27th of November, the strike had fizzled out. So what was driving the strike? What was driving it? And again, from my reading, it seems to me that Olsen has done a bit of work on this. Most of the strikers were mainly single, young, and the specials for that matter, mainly single, young, Pākehā men. And they were probably just having the time of their lives. The specials, young men came in from rural areas to the big smoke. They were issued a baton. The pubs welcomed them. They had money in their pockets. And it would have all been a bit of a holiday with a bit of biffo. The strikers, predominantly single young men, they were enjoying freedom from work, at least until the money ran out, and the excitement and the violence, such as it was probably exhilarating. No one on both sides really knew what a revolution looked like, or how to carry one out, or stop it if it did indeed occur. Most militant unionists, the Wobblies indeed, were not ready for organised violence. In fact, it ran counter to their beliefs. And there was no real coherent plan or method. So by the 18th of December, all the major ports have been reopened, and the end is really only then a matter of time. But the irony was that those farmers' sons and farm workers and other scabs who were working on the waterfront soon lost their appetite for the dirty, dangerous work around the clock, and productivity plummeted. It wasn't a holiday anymore. So, did we come close to a revolution? Well, in a word, no, we didn't. There was no united revolutionary class, which I would argue is a prerequisite for a revolution. The vast majority of workers remained aloof, and enough were prepared to scab to break the strikes. The urban bourgeoisie and farmers were far from indifferent, however. The employers were driven by a fear of militant unions. They were emboldened by Massey's government. The farmers, as they saw it, were fighting for their livelihood. It was their butter that was going off on the wharfs, and they were organised enough to reopen them. And there was a lack of confidence and an appetite for extreme measures amongst even the most militant union leadership. If you compare the biographies of Stalin, Trotsky and Lenin with Pat Hickey, Tom Barker and Joseph Savage, Bob Semple, for all the words, they're a world apart. So what were the consequences of 1913? Arguably, the labour movement came out stronger. The perceived ruthlessness of Massey and the naked use of state power to break the strikes united the union movement. You might argue over arbitrationism and direct action, but using special constables to beat up strikers is going too far. The unions did survive and they gained experience. Unions learned that unity and clear goals were a prerequisite for a successful strike. If there was no unity around direct action, then arbitration offered an easy way out. Unions learned that a dispute over travel allowance might be part of larger issues relating to social justice, class and power, but striking in these circumstances is merely preparation for getting back around that table. Unions learned a successful general strike is extremely difficult to organise and is arguably only a weapon in an existential struggle where there is no table to get around. Some commentators say that the tactics of organising at the point of production were normalised. I think that's very questionable. I don't think many unions organise at the point of production today. And I would argue that back then it was at best patchy. The Wobblies were discredited, perhaps unfairly, but that part of their strategy that said parliamentary reform was a total waste of time was discredited. People like Michael Savage had seen the power of the state, and he and others like him changed his tune, and we all know what he became. Unions learned that they could break the law if enough workers broke it. At one point, the Supreme Court brought out a decision that said any donations to support strikers were illegal. And again, this was an overstretch, because if 500 Auckland carpenters donated an illegal shilling to striking workers, there was very little the government could do. So both the unions and the government learned the limit of the law. The Union Steamship Company, remember them, they were pivotal in encouraging peace with honour and curbing the more militant employers. They saw the value in strong non-revolutionary unions in propping up capitalism. Massey and his government learned the price of confrontation was steep, as it risked compromising consensus, especially when the exogenous strain of what followed hit. And we really have to look at 1913 through the lens of what followed. In 1920, the biggest general strike the world had ever seen took place in Germany, when millions of unionists stopped an extreme right-wing military coup, the so-called Kapp Putsch. The putschists couldn't even find a secretary in Berlin to type up their declarations. It stopped the lot. 1920 was a mere 7 years after the events of 1913 in New Zealand, but a lot of water had passed under the bridge. In 1913, there had been a wave of strikes across the globe, but these are understandably overshadowed by what followed, as British bricklayers and German labourers donned uniform and took up arms against one another. Millions were mobilised from global empires to fight and die in what became known as the Great War. And one of the things that's often overlooked is the numbers of strikes and mutinies that took place amongst workers and soldiers through that war. In New Zealand, Massey bought industrial peace He went into a coalition with Joseph Ward's Liberals. He secured a guaranteed market for New Zealand's exports. Chris Trotters called it blood for butter. Sent the New Zealand division to die in Flanders, or Gallipoli and then Flanders. But at the time, in the row over conscription, and according to Olsen, the most radical in its programme, Labour Party in the Empire was formed in 1916 here in New Zealand. 4 of the empires that were involved in the Great War had ceased to exist, either by its end or shortly afterwards. Revolution swept across Europe. A Bolshevik government was fighting for its life in Russia. Turkey in Asia Minor was in tumult as French and British diplomats drew lines on maps that still cause problems today. German sailors triggered a revolution in Germany, and a social democrat leader in Germany used far-right muscle to crush a communist uprising. So in New Zealand, some historians argue that the social liberal experiment had run its course by 1908, when the Trade Union Act was passed and when the militancy started to rear its head. Universal suffrage and equality before the law hadn't delivered material prosperity for all. What 1913 and the formation of the New Zealand Labour Party did, these historians argue, is inject a class dimension into the equation. So when corporatist social liberalism regained power in 1935, it had a class basis. And the Labour Party today, I believe, should take note of that. An industrial working class was forged out of the experience of 1913, but it was built around a relatively small number of unionised workers in key industries. These were the mines, the freezing works, the wharves and the railways. The urban middle classes and those who aspired to be middle class through what was a relatively high standard of living in global terms fostered the myth of the so-called classless society. The division between urban unionised New Zealand and small-town rural New Zealand was solidified. Although remember, many unionised freezing workers were located in small rural towns. And like Peter Clayworth, I do wonder when the men who had been on one side of the picket line in 1913 and on the other side were in the trenches together at Gallipoli and in Flanders, whether they settled their differences. All of the fissures or all the divisions in New Zealand society that I've talked about, I would argue were thrown into sharp relief in future disputes, such as in 1951, but also again in 1981, when they required a racial dimension. I think if we apply the same standards to 1981 as some people applied to 1913, when we were supposedly close to civil war or revolution, then arguably we came closer to civil war during the Springbok tour. But that, I think, is probably the subject of a talk by John Minto and not me. All right. How did we go? Not bad. Just before 8 o'clock.